Fluorescent lights hum overhead, casting long, sharp shadows across the mahogany boardroom table. A silver pen snaps in half. It is a violent, sudden crack in the dead silence. Dominic doesn't raise his voice when he gives an order. He has never needed to. The men in tailored suits sweat through their silk collars, waiting for the axe to fall. But Dominic isn't looking at them. His dark eyes are fixed solely on the trembling hands of his ironclad secretary, and the man who put that tremor there. Norah Hayes did not ask questions about the shipping manifests. If 3 tons of imported olive oil happened to require an armored escort from the port of Miami to a warehouse in Chicago, she simply filed the requisition forms. She checked the boxes. She ensured the invoices were paid on time, routed through 3 different shell corporations before landing cleanly in the ledger of Russo Logistics. It was a Tuesday morning. It was raining. The drops hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the 64th floor, blurring the Chicago skyline into a gray, weeping smear. Norah stood by the espresso machine in the executive antechamber. The grinder whirred, a harsh, mechanical grinding noise that drowned out the silence of the empty office. She watched the dark liquid pull into the porcelain cup. 3 seconds of extraction. No sugar. A splash of cold water to bring the temperature down to exactly what her boss preferred. She wore a charcoal gray pencil skirt, a high-collared white blouse, and black stilettos. Her hair was pulled back into a severe French twist. It was armor. Every pin, every crease, every meticulously chosen neutral color was a barricade between her and the reality of the men she worked for. The heavy oak door to the inner office clicked open. Dominic Russo walked in. He didn't swagger. Men who owned the city didn't need to strut. He moved with a terrifying economy of motion, a quiet, heavy presence that sucked the air out of the room. He wore a navy suit that cost more than Norah's first car. His tie was loosened. Shadows clung to the sharp angles of his jaw, framing eyes the color of cold earth. "Morning, Norah," he said. His voice was a low rumble, worn down by cheap cigars and late-night phone calls he never let her listen in on. "Mr. Russo!" She turned, holding the saucer. She stepped forward and placed it on his desk exactly 2 inches from the edge of his leather blotter. "The quarterly reports are in the red folder. The updated route maps for the eastern seaboard are in the blue. You have the merger meeting with the Callaway Group at 10. Dominic picked up the coffee. He didn't look at the folders. He looked at her. He always looked at her a second too long. It wasn't predatory. It was analytical. Dominic dismantled engines in his spare time. Norah often felt he looked at people the same way, searching for the loose screw, the rusted joint. "You're here early," he noted. He took a sip. Perfect temperature, as always. The Callaway file required double-checking. Their asset declarations didn't match their tax filings from 2024. I reran the numbers. Dominic's lip twitched. It was the closest he ever came to a smile. "They're trying to hide a fleet of trucks." "They're doing a poor job of it," Norah replied smoothly. "Good. We'll gut them on the valuation." Dominic set the cup down. "Sit with me during the meeting. I want you taking notes. If their CEO hesitates, I want it documented." "Understood." Norah turned to walk back to her desk. "Norah?" She paused, looking over her shoulder. Dominic was leaning against the edge of his desk, arms crossed over his broad chest. The city wept behind him. "You look tired." It was a statement of fact, devoid of pity. Norah's spine stiffened. She hated when he noticed the cracks. She had spent the weekend boxing up the last of the things from her old apartment. The apartment she used to share. The memories had kept her awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling the phantom weight of a hand on her waist that hadn't been there in 3 years. "I'm perfectly fine, Mr. Russo, just focusing on the merger." He stared at her. The silence stretched, heavy and thick. Finally, he gave a slow nod. 10 o'clock, bring the red folder." She escaped to her desk. She sank into her ergonomic chair and pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes until stars bloomed in the darkness. She was fine. She was 31 years old, making 6 figures, and entirely independent. She didn't need to be tired. She didn't need to be haunted. She arranged her pens. She smoothed her skirt. She checked her watch. 9:45. The Callaway Group was a legitimate front. Everyone knew it. They moved legitimate freight. But they also moved things that didn't appear on paper. Dominic was buying them out to monopolize the transit routes across the Midwest. It was supposed to be a standard hostile takeover. Walk in, lay the leverage on the table, watch them fold, and sign the papers. Norah gathered her tablet and the red folder. She walked back into the boardroom connected to Dominic's office. It smelled of lemon polish and expensive leather. She set Dominic's chair at the head of the table. She took her seat directly to his right, fading into the background. A ghost with a stylus. At 9:55, the elevator chimed in the distance. Heavy footsteps echoed down the hardwood hallway. Muffled voices, the aggressive, false cheer of corporate posturing. Dominic walked in through his private door. He buttoned his suit jacket, his expression hardening into granite. The businessman disappeared. The boss took his seat. The double doors opened. Norah didn't look up immediately. She was typing the date and time into her tablet, her fingers flying over the glass screen. "Dominic, a pleasure," a booming voice. Richard Callaway, the aging patriarch of the group. "Richard, sit," Dominic replied, a command disguised as an invitation. Norah tapped the screen, locking in the header. She finally looked up to take a head count. Richard. 2 lawyers in gray suits. A nervous-looking CFO clutching a briefcase like a life preserver. And a 5th man. A man pulling out a chair opposite Norah. A man wearing a bespoke charcoal suit, his blonde hair swept back exactly the way it used to be. He was laughing at something one of the lawyers said, a sharp, arrogant sound that hit Norah's ears like shattered glass. The stylus slipped from her fingers. It clattered loudly against the mahogany table. The man stopped laughing. He looked across the table. His blue eyes locked onto hers. Caleb. The air in the boardroom turned to ash in Norah's lungs. She couldn't breathe. Her heart, normally a steady rhythmic metronome, began to thrash violently against her ribs. Caleb Pierce was supposed to be in New York. He was supposed to be working his way up the corporate ladder at a mid-tier banking firm, charming the partners' wives and taking credit for other people's work. He wasn't supposed to be here, not in Chicago, not in Dominic Russo's boardroom. Caleb's expression mirrored hers for a fraction of a second. Shock, followed by a sudden, sickening gleam of amusement. His lips curled into that familiar, lopsided smirk. The one that used to make her stomach flutter. The one she now realized was the prelude to a lie. "Well," Caleb murmured, his voice cutting through the rustle of briefcases and pulling out chairs. Small world. Norah's hands were shaking. She quickly pulled them off the table, burying them in her lap. Her nails dug into her thighs through the fabric of her skirt. Breathe, she commanded herself. Do not let him see you bleed. Dominic's head turned. Slowly. He looked at Caleb. Then he looked at Norah. Dominic missed nothing. He saw the stylus on the table. He saw the rigid line of Norah's shoulders. He saw the sudden, stark pallor of her skin. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "You know my secretary, Mr. Pierce?" Dominic asked. The tone was conversational, mild. It was the same tone he used right before he ruined a man's life. Caleb chuckled, leaning back in his chair. He exuded an unearned confidence, entirely unaware of the apex predator sitting at the head of the table. "You could say that. We go way back. Didn't expect to see you fetching coffee, Norah. Thought you were destined for bigger things." It was a deliberate strike, a public belittlement designed to throw her off balance. Norah swallowed the lump of bile rising in her throat. She forced her hands to unclench, picking up the stylus with stiff, robotic fingers. She looked at the tablet screen. It was a blur. "Mr. Pierce," Norah said, her voice sounding thin and reedy to her own ears. "We are here to discuss the merger." "Straight to business. Always were a bit stiff," Caleb sneered playfully. He looked at Richard Calloway. "Norah and I have a history. We were engaged." The word dropped like a lead weight in the center of the table. The Calloway men chuckled nervously, unsure of how to read the room. Dominic did not chuckle. He didn't move. He sat perfectly still, his dark eyes fixed on Caleb. The silence stretched, thin and tight as piano wire. The nervous laughter from the Calloway side died a quick, awkward death. "Is that so?" Dominic said softly. "Ancient history," Caleb said, with a dismissive wave of his hand. "Different lifetimes. I moved on. Glad to see she found a job." Norah felt the heat rising in her cheeks. Humiliation burned like a fever. He had left her a month before the wedding, cleared out the joint bank account, and moved to Manhattan with a 23-year-old paralegal, leaving Norah to face the caterers, the guests, and the crushing debt of a canceled reception. It had taken her years to rebuild the wall he tore down, and with one smirk, he was chipping at the mortar. "Let's get down to the numbers, Dominic," Richard Calloway interrupted, sensing the sudden hostility, but misinterpreting the source. "My team here, including Caleb, who handles our acquisitions, has looked over your initial offer. We find it lacking." Dominic shifted his gaze to Richard. The lethal intensity vanished, replaced by cold, calculating business. "You find 80 million lacking for a fleet of aging trucks and a union problem you can't solve," Dominic stated. The meeting began. For the next 45 minutes, Norah existed in a state of dissociative panic. She typed. She recorded the numbers. She noted the hesitations, just as Dominic had ordered. But her skin crawled. Every time she looked up, Caleb was staring at her. He wasn't paying attention to the negotiations. He was watching her. He was dissecting the fit of her blouse, the severity of her hair. He was enjoying her discomfort. He would periodically lean forward and whisper something to the lawyer next to him, never taking his eyes off Norah. She wanted to run. She wanted to stand up, throw the tablet at his smug face, and run into the rain. But she was Norah Hayes, and she worked for Dominic Russo. "You do not run. Your valuation fails to account for the real estate," Caleb chimed in suddenly, slapping a folder onto the table. He looked directly at Norah. "We own the distribution centers outright. 14 acres of prime industrial land. You want the roots, you buy the dirt they sit on. The price is $120 million. Not a penny less. Dominic leaned back. He picked up his silver pen, turning it end over end between his fingers. The land is polluted, Pierce, Dominic said, quietly. Industrial runoff from the previous owners. The EPA is sniffing around. I'd have to sink $20 million into remediation just to keep the feds off the property line. The real estate is a liability. You're lucky I'm taking it off your hands. Caleb's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to being shut down so efficiently. He looked at Norah, as if expecting her to shrink under his frustration. We're not moving on the price, Caleb snapped. Take it or leave it. Caleb, Richard hissed under his breath. This wasn't a bank. You didn't give Dominic Russo ultimatums. Dominic stopped spinning the pen. He set it down. We will take a 10-minute recess, Dominic announced, his voice devoid of inflection. Richard, you will explain to your acquisitions manager who he is speaking to, and then you will come back with a realistic number. Dominic stood up. The meeting was paused. The Calloway men scrambled out of their chairs, moving toward the hallway to regroup and argue in private. Norah kept her head down, desperately organizing the digital files, praying Caleb would follow them out. He didn't. As the boardroom cleared, the heavy doors shutting behind Richard Calloway, Caleb rounded the large table. He walked slowly, a predator cornering a wounded bird. Norah's fingers froze on the glass screen. The only other person in the room was Dominic, who had walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows, his back turned to them, staring out at the rain. Caleb stopped right behind Norah's chair. She could smell his cologne, sandalwood, and expensive gin. The scent made her violently nauseous. You look tight, Norah, Caleb murmured, his voice dropping low, intended only for her. Working for a glorified mobster. Is the pay worth the anxiety? Because you look like you're about to snap. Step away from my chair, Caleb, Norah said. Her voice shook. She hated herself for it. Caleb leaned down, bracing his hands on the armrests of her chair, trapping her. He invaded her space, bringing his mouth close to her ear. Still giving orders you can't back up, he whispered. A nasty, familiar cruelty edging into his tone. I saw the way you looked when I walked in. You're still not over it, are you? Still the same pathetic, needy girl waiting for a ring? Norah's breath hitched. A tear, hot and unbidden, pricked the corner of her eye. She clamped her jaw shut, refusing to let it fall. Suddenly, a shadow fell over the table. It engulfed them both. Caleb stopped talking, the smug aura evaporating instantly. Before her fingers could touch the brass, she heard the distinct, heavy click of a key turning in the lock from the outside. Clara froze. She stepped back as the door swung open. Dominic stood on the opposite side of the table, leaning forward on his knuckles. His eyes were entirely black. Dead. Is there a problem here? Dominic asked. No problem, Russo, Caleb stammered slightly, clearing his throat. Just catching up with an old friend, telling her she looks good. A little tense, maybe. Dominic's gaze flicked to Norah. He saw the white-knuckle grip she had on the tablet. He saw the sheen of moisture in her eyes that she was furiously trying to blink away. He saw the way she shrank into the leather of her chair, trying to make herself small. Norah had never missed a day of work. She had never complained. She had stood between Dominic and federal indictments with the stroke of a pen and a steel spine. She was his responsibility, his right hand. Dominic looked back at Caleb. He didn't shout. He didn't swear. He simply reached out and picked up the silver pen from the table. With a sickening crack, he snapped the solid metal pen cleanly in half. Ink bled over his fingers, dark and staining like bruised blood. He dropped the broken halves onto the polished mahogany. They clattered loudly in the silent room. Caleb flinched, taking another step back, bumping into the wall. "You don't talk to her," Dominic commanded. The quietness of his voice made it infinitely worse. "You don't look at her. You do not breathe the air in her immediate vicinity. If you look at my secretary again, I will have you removed from this building, and I won't use the elevator." Caleb swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. The arrogance was completely gone, replaced by a primal, instinctive terror. He suddenly realized the rumors about Dominic Russo weren't corporate exaggerations. "I was just," Caleb tried. "You were leaving the room," Dominic cut him off. Caleb looked at Norah one last time, a fleeting glance of embarrassment and anger, before turning and practically fleeing toward the double doors. The heavy oak slammed shut behind him. The silence returned. Thick, suffocating. Norah sat frozen. The adrenaline was draining out of her, leaving her hollow and trembling. She stared at the broken pen on the table, the ink pooling on the expensive wood. Dominic pulled a handkerchief from his pocket. He calmly wiped the ink from his fingers. He didn't ask if she was okay. He didn't offer empty platitudes. He knew they were useless. He walked around the table and stopped next to her. He looked down at her shaking hands. "He was your fiancé," Dominic stated. Norah nodded once, jerky and tight. "Yes." "He broke your heart." "Yes," her voice cracked. She hated the weakness, but she couldn't hide it from him. Not now. Dominic stared at her for a long moment. He saw the ghost of the girl she used to be, warring with the armored woman she had become. He knew exactly what men like Caleb Pierce did to women like Norah. They fed on them. They broke them down to build themselves up. Dominic tossed the stained handkerchief onto the table. "When they come back in," Dominic said, his voice dropping, losing its sharp edge but retaining all of its iron. "He is going to look at you. He won't be able to help himself. He needs to know he still has power over you." Norah closed her eyes. "I know. You are not going to let him." Norah opened her eyes, looking up at her boss. "How?" Dominic reached down. His large, warm hand covered her trembling ones. The contact was shocking. It was the first time in 3 years he had ever touched her. His grip was firm, grounding, anchoring her to the present. "When he looks at you," Dominic ordered, his dark eyes locking onto hers, burning with a fierce, terrifying possessiveness. "Tell him you're taken." Norah stopped breathing. The heavy rain battered the glass behind Dominic, but the sound seemed miles away. All she could focus on was the heat of his hand over hers and the absolute, unyielding command in his voice. "Tell him you're taken." She stared at him, her mind spinning wildly, trying to process the data. Was it a tactic? A power play to unnerve the opposition? With Dominic, business and violence were often intertwined, indistinguishable from one another. "Mr. Russo," she started, her voice barely a whisper. "Dominic," he corrected smoothly. He didn't move his hand. He simply adjusted his grip, his thumb brushing against her knuckles. The skin-on-skin contact sent a jolt of electricity up her arm, entirely bypassing her carefully constructed armor. "Dominic," she breathed, correcting herself. "I don't understand. If I say that, it implies that Caleb Pierce no longer holds the deed to your head," Dominic said flatly. "It implies he has been replaced by someone who does not tolerate disrespect. He is a coward, Norah. Cowards only attack when they think the target is undefended." He slowly withdrew his hand. The absence of his warmth left her hands feeling colder than before. He walked back to his chair at the head of the table. He sat down, straightening his cuffs, adjusting his tie. The brief moment of intense intimacy vanished, swallowed by the imposing figure of the Mafia boss. "But it's a lie," Norah managed to say, clutching her tablet to her chest. Dominic looked at her, a dark, impenetrable stare. "Is it?" Before she could dissect the gravity of that question, the heavy double doors creaked open. The Calloway men filed back in. They looked defeated. The brief 10-minute recess had clearly been a frantic argument in the hallway, ending in surrender. Caleb walked in last. He avoided Dominic's gaze entirely. He looked pale, the edges of his arrogance thoroughly blunted. He took his seat, keeping his eyes fixed firmly on the polished wood in front of him. Richard Calloway cleared his throat. "Dominic, we've discussed the environmental concerns regarding the real estate. We are willing to adjust our asking price to $95 million for the entire package. Assets, roots, and land." Dominic leaned back. He steepled his fingers. He let the silence drag out, letting the Calloway men sweat. He made them wait 10 seconds. 20. 90, Dominic finally countered. "Dominic, be reasonable," Richard started. 90, Dominic repeated. The word struck like a hammer on an anvil. "And Pierce steps down from handling the transition. I don't want his name on a single document crossing my desk." Caleb's head snapped up. His face flushed a dark, ugly red. "You can't do that. I brought this deal to the table. You brought a bloated corpse to my table and tried to sell it as a marathon runner," Dominic said coldly. "You're out. Or the deal dies right here, and I let the union strike bleed you dry by November." Richard put a heavy hand on Caleb's arm, squeezing it in warning. "Agreed," Richard said tightly. 90 million. Caleb will be reassigned to the New York office immediately. It was over. A corporate execution performed with surgical precision. Norah typed the finalized numbers into the tablet. Her hands had stopped shaking. The phantom weight of Caleb's presence, the anxiety that had choked her for the past hour, was gone. It had been systematically dismantled and crushed by the man sitting beside her. "Have the contracts drafted by Friday," Dominic said, standing up. The meeting was concluded. The Calloway men stood, eager to escape the room. Richard shook Dominic's hand quickly before ushering his lawyers out. Caleb lingered. He packed his briefcase with slow, deliberate movements. His pride was in tatters. He had been humiliated in front of his boss, stripped of his commission, and banished back to New York. And he knew exactly why. As the others left the room, Caleb snapped his briefcase shut. He looked across the table at Norah. The fear Dominic had instilled in him was warring with a bitter, toxic resentment. He couldn't attack Dominic, but he could still try to claw back some shred of dignity by hurting her. He walked around the table, but he stopped a safe distance away, keeping an eye on Dominic, who was gathering his folders. "Quite the guard dog you've got yourself, Norah," Caleb sneered, his voice low and ugly. "Is that how you climbed the ladder here? Trading one bed for another?" The old Norah, the girl who cried in a wedding dress, would have shattered. She would have dropped her eyes, taken the hit, and bled in silence. Norah looked at Caleb. She saw the weak chin. She saw the desperation in his eyes. She saw a boy trying to play a man's game and losing catastrophically. She felt Dominic pause beside her, the heavy protective presence radiating from him. He didn't speak. He didn't intervene. He was waiting. He had given her the weapon. Now he was waiting to see if she would swing it. Norah stood up. She smoothed her charcoal skirt. She picked up her tablet. She looked Caleb dead in the eye, her posture perfectly straight, her expression an unreadable mask of ice. "My personal life is none of your concern, Caleb," Norah said. Her voice was steady, ringing clearly in the quiet room. "But for the record," she paused. She let the silence stretch, just like Dominic did. She let Caleb wait. "I'm taken." Caleb froze. The sneer faltered on his lips. He looked from Norah to the imposing dark figure of Dominic standing right beside her, their shoulders mere inches apart. The reality of the situation, the quiet intimacy, the violent defense, finally clicked in his small mind. He wasn't just dealing with a boss protecting an employee. He was dealing with a man protecting his own. Caleb opened his mouth, then closed it. The last remaining scraps of his ego dissolved. He gripped his briefcase, turned on his heel, and walked out of the boardroom without another word. Norah watched the door click shut. The silence rushed back in, but it wasn't heavy anymore. It felt clean. The ghost had been exorcised. She let out a long, shuddering breath, her shoulders dropping an inch. "Good girl," a low rumble sounded beside her. Norah turned her head. Dominic was looking at her. The cold, dead shark eyes were gone. In their place was a simmering dark heat that made the breath catch in her throat all over again. "Thank you," Norah whispered. For stepping in." "I didn't do anything," Dominic said, picking up the red folder. "You pulled the trigger." He turned to walk back into his office. "Dominic," Norah called out before she could stop herself. He stopped at the door, looking back over his shoulder. "Was it just a tactic?" she asked, her heart hammering against her ribs. Telling him that? Dominic looked at her for a long time. The rain continued to beat against the glass, a chaotic drumline behind his silent, imposing figure. "I don't lie in my boardroom, Norah," Dominic said softly. "Bring the revised contracts to my desk." He stepped into his office, leaving the door open. Norah stood alone in the boardroom. She looked down at her hands. They weren't shaking. She picked up the broken pieces of the silver pen from the table, holding them tight in her palm, and followed him in. Norah kept the pen. She told herself it was evidence, a reminder of the volatile nature of the man who signed her paychecks. But when she placed the two broken silver halves into the shallow tray of her top desk drawer, burying them beneath a stack of highlighters, she knew she was lying to herself. It wasn't a warning. It was a trophy. By Thursday night, the Chicago rain had turned to sleet, pelting the reinforced glass of the 64th floor with a sound like throwing sand. The rest of the executive floor had emptied out at 5. Norah was still at her desk at 9:30. The Callaway acquisition was a disorganized disaster. Richard Calloway had run his logistics empire on handshakes and golf course promises, leaving behind a paper trail that looked like a shredded ransom note. Norah sat surrounded by 6 different open ledgers, her glasses sliding down the bridge of her nose. The door to the inner office was open. It had stayed open since Tuesday. "You are fixing a rounding error that amounts to $400. Dominic's voice drifted out from the darkened room. Norah didn't flinch. She had grown accustomed to his unnatural stillness. He had been sitting in the leather chair in the corner of his office for the last hour, reading a leather-bound folio, barely making a sound. "It's $412, Dominic," Norah corrected, typing a string of digits into her spreadsheet. Using his first name still felt like stepping off a ledge. And it's not about the amount. It's a systemic error in their payroll software. If I don't patch it now, it compounds next quarter. It's 10 o'clock. I am aware of how clocks work. A heavy silence followed. It wasn't the suffocating, terrifying silence of the boardroom. It was a quiet, assessing wait. Norah heard the scrape of a chair leg, followed by the heavy, measured tread of his footsteps on the hardwood. He walked into the antechamber and stopped beside her desk. He had discarded his jacket and tie hours ago. The top 2 buttons of his crisp white shirt were undone. Beneath the expensive cotton, the dark leather straps of a shoulder holster rested flat against his ribs. He didn't try to hide it. He never had. It was a calculated part of the ecosystem they existed in. Dominic dropped a white paper bag onto her desk. It landed heavily, right on top of a stack of Callaway tax returns. The smell of roasted garlic and seared meat instantly flooded the sterile air. "Eat," he ordered. Norah looked up. "I'm not hungry." "You haven't eaten since a single piece of toast at 7 this morning," Dominic stated. "You had 3 espressos. You went to the vending machine on the 42nd floor at 3, but it was jammed, so you came back with nothing. Eat the steak." Norah stared at him. The sheer, terrifying scope of his awareness was paralyzing. "Are you having security track my elevator swipes?" "I don't need security to tell me you're running on fumes." He reached out, tapping the side of the paper bag with one heavy finger. "Open it, or I will stand here and watch you chew." He would do it too. Norah sighed, sliding her glasses up her nose. She pulled the styrofoam container from the bag. It was prime rib from the steakhouse down the street, the one that required reservations 3 months in advance. It was still steaming. She picked up the plastic fork provided and took a bite. The flavor was rich, grounding her suddenly spinning head. Dominic leaned against the edge of her desk, crossing his arms. He watched her. "You didn't ask about Pierce," Dominic said, quietly. Norah chewed, swallowed, and kept her eyes on the styrofoam box. "He was reassigned. You made that clear." "I made a phone call," Dominic corrected. "His firm in New York relies heavily on our shipping lanes for their physical asset transfers. He was terminated at 4 p.m. today. He is currently unemployed." Norah's fork paused in the air. She looked up at him. Dominic's face was unreadable, a slab of granite carved with sharp, unforgiving lines. He wasn't bragging. He was delivering a status report. He had surgically removed a tumor from her life, and he was simply confirming the operation was a success. "You didn't have to do that," she said, her voice tight. "I protect my investments," Dominic replied smoothly. "You were distracted. Now you are not." It was a cold, pragmatic excuse. They both knew it. Dominic Russo did not ruin a mid-level banking manager over a $400 rounding error. Norah set the fork down. The cynical armor she wore so tightly felt suddenly fragile. "Why did you hire me, Dominic? 3 years ago. I was a mess. I was drowning in debt from a canceled wedding. My resume was adequate, but I wasn't corporate cutthroat material." "Why me?" Dominic looked down at her. The shadows of the dimly lit office clung to his jaw. "Because you were angry," he said simply. "Everyone else who interviewed for this job wanted to be rich, or they wanted to feel dangerous by proximity. You just wanted to survive. I saw a woman who had the worst day of her life, and instead of breaking, she built a wall. I needed someone who could build walls." He pushed off the desk, his tall frame looming over her for a fraction of a second. "Finish the steak. Leave the ledgers. The money will still be missing tomorrow." He turned and walked back into his office. Norah sat in the quiet, the taste of garlic on her tongue, staring at the empty doorway. She wasn't just an employee anymore. She was a wall he had decided to stand behind, and for the first time in 3 years, she didn't want to keep him out. The reality of Dominic Russo's world rarely bled onto the 64th floor. He kept the violence quarantined. The warehouses in Southside, the docks, the back rooms of social clubs. That was where the ugly work happened. The corporate office was a sanctuary of spreadsheets and legitimate tax brackets. Until Monday morning, Norah was pouring a fresh carafe of water when the private elevator chimed. It wasn't the main banks. It was the secure lift that bypassed reception, dropping directly into Dominic's private foyer. The heavy steel door slid open. Dominic walked out. He wasn't wearing his suit jacket. His tie was missing. His white dress shirt, usually immaculate, was torn at the shoulder, the crisp fabric stained with a dark, rust-colored smear. Norah froze, the glass pitcher heavy in her hand. Behind him walked Leo, a mountain of a man who served as Dominic's driver and shadow. Leo looked entirely unbothered, though his knuckles were heavily bruised. Dominic didn't look at Norah immediately. He walked straight past her desk, heading for his office. "Canceled the 11 o'clock with the Port Authority. Tell them there was a scheduling conflict. Get Thomas on the line and tell him to draft a severance package for the Callaway regional manager. Standard NDA. If he balks, tell him the severance is keeping him out of the river." The words were clipped. The tone was absolute ice. "Dominic," Norah said. He stopped at the threshold of his office. He turned his head. She saw it then, a sharp, ugly split on his lower lip, a darkening bruise along his left cheekbone. It wasn't a catastrophic beating, but it was a violation. Someone had put their hands on the untouchable man. Leo grunted from the hallway. "Guy had a concealed piece, boss. Didn't want to let the transit routes go without a severance bonus. He swung first." "He swung last," Dominic corrected quietly, never breaking eye contact with Norah. "Make the calls, Norah." He walked into his office and shut the heavy oak door. It was a dismissal, a sharp, distinct line drawn in the sand. Do the paperwork. Ignore the blood. Norah set the water pitcher down. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She looked at her computer screen. The calendar blinked, a neat, orderly grid of meetings and conference calls. It was a fiction, a paper-thin illusion covering a world of concealed weapons and shattered teeth. She picked up the phone. She dialed Thomas, the lead fixer for the legal department. She gave the instructions in a flat, emotionless voice. She canceled the Port Authority meeting. Then she stood up. She walked into the private executive restroom down the hall. She opened the cabinet above the sink and pulled out the white plastic first aid kit. It had sat untouched for 3 years, a mandatory OSHA requirement gathering dust. She walked back to Dominic's office. She didn't knock. She turned the brass handle and pushed the door open. Dominic was standing by the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the city. He had taken his shoulder holster off. It sat on his desk, heavy and lethal. He held a glass of dark amber liquid in his right hand. He didn't turn around when the door clicked shut. "I told you to make the calls." "The calls are made," Norah said. Her voice was steady, surprising even herself. She walked across the vast expanse of the office. Her heels clicked softly on the Persian rug. She set the plastic kit on the edge of his mahogany desk, right next to the holster. The juxtaposition was jarring. Healing and death, separated by 2 inches of polished wood. Dominic finally turned. He looked at the kit. He looked at her. His jaw tightened. "I don't need a nurse." "You are bleeding on a $3,000 rug," Norah pointed out calmly. She snapped the plastic latches open. She pulled out a sterile alcohol pad and tore the foil wrapper. "Norah!" It was a warning, low and dangerous. She ignored it. She stepped around the desk, invading his personal space. She had to tilt her head up to look him in the eye. Up close, the damage was more pronounced. The cut on his lip was still oozing slowly. "Sit on the edge of the desk," she instructed. Dominic stared down at her. His dark eyes searched her face, looking for disgust, looking for the fear that Caleb had shown, looking for the crack that would send her running back to the safe, sterile corporate world. He found nothing but calm, unwavering resolve. Slowly, deliberately, he leaned back against the edge of the heavy desk, bracing his hands on either side of his hips. He surrendered to her order. Norah stepped between his knees. The proximity was electric. She could feel the heat radiating off his chest. He smelled of rain, gunpowder, and the metallic tang of blood. She reached up with the alcohol pad. Her hand was steady, but she felt his breath catch slightly as her fingers grazed his jawline to steady his head. "This is going to sting," she murmured. "I've had worse," he replied softly. She pressed the pad to his split lip. Dominic didn't flinch. He didn't blink. He just watched her. The intensity of his gaze was a physical weight, pressing down on her chest, stealing the oxygen from the room. "You shouldn't be seeing this," Dominic said, his voice a low rumble vibrating through his chest and into her fingertips. "The business on paper is yours. This side, this isn't for you. I filed the paperwork that absorbed a hostile territory, Dominic. Did you think I believed we acquired those routes with a polite email?" Norah wiped away the dried blood, dropping the stained pad into the trash can by his leg. She opened a small tube of antiseptic ointment. She dabbed it onto her thumb and gently pressed it against his cut. "People who see this side run away," he stated. His hand twitched on the edge of the desk, as if he wanted to reach up and grab her wrist, but was forcing himself to stay still. Norah met his dead earth eyes. "Do I look like I'm running?" Dominic's breathing shifted. It became slower, heavier. The space between them evaporated. "No," he whispered. You look like you're exactly where you belong." The invitation was heavy cardstock, edged in gold foil, demanding their presence at the annual Great Lakes Shipping Association Gala. It was a political necessity. The Callaway acquisition had sent ripples through the Midwest logistics network. Rivals were circling, smelling blood in the water, waiting to see if Dominic Russo could actually hold the territory he had violently seized. He needed to be seen. He needed to project absolute, impenetrable stability. And he needed her. "You are attending," Dominic had told her on Wednesday, tossing the invitation onto her keyboard. "Buy a dress. Expel it to the firm. We leave at 7 on Saturday." It wasn't a request. Now, standing in the marble foyer of the Palmer House Hilton, Norah felt the weight of that command. She wore black. It was the only color that felt appropriate for standing next to the devil. The dress was silk, floor length, with a high neck that mirrored her usual severe work attire, but the back plunged in a deep V, exposing the pale skin of her spine. It was armor, but of a different kind. Dominic stood beside her. In a custom tuxedo, he looked less like a businessman and more like an executioner attending a coronation. The ballroom was a sea of false smiles, clinking champagne glasses, and ruthlessly calculated alliances. The moment they stepped through the heavy gold doors, the temperature in the room seemed to drop. The ambient chatter dialed down a fraction. Eyes tracked them. Norah felt the immediate, suffocating pressure of being observed. These were dangerous people hiding behind philanthropic tax write-offs. She instinctively stiffened, her posture locking into the rigid, invisible secretary she played on the 64th floor. She took a half step back, preparing to fall into his shadow. Dominic stopped. He didn't look at the crowd. He turned his head and looked down at her. "You are not taking notes tonight," he said, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear it beneath the string quartet playing in the corner. He reached out, his large hand flattened against the exposed skin of her lower back. Norah gasped silently. His palm was burning hot against the chill of the ballroom air. His fingers curled slightly, gripping the curve of her waist, anchoring her to his side. It was a deliberate, possessive brand. "Walk with me," he ordered softly. He didn't just guide her forward, he presented her. As they moved through the crowd, Norah realized exactly what he was doing. Men who would normally sneer at a secretary, men who viewed women as interchangeable accessories or leverage, took one look at where Dominic's hand rested and physically backed away. He was broadcasting the lie he had told Caleb in the boardroom. He was making it a public truth. Taken. They approached a circle of older men smoking cigars near the terrace doors. Norah recognized 2 state senators and the head of the Longshoremen's Union. "Dominic," the union boss boomed, stepping forward with a forced smile. "A brutal takeover last week. You left the Callaway boys bleeding on the pavement." "I left them with a generous severance," Dominic replied smoothly, his grip on Norah's waist tightening a fraction. "They were careless with their assets. I am not." Clearly, the man's eyes slid to Norah, traveling up the length of the black silk. It was an assessing, sleazy look. "And who is this lovely creature? An upgrade from the usual legal counsel, I see." The silence that followed was violent. Dominic didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten. He simply shifted his weight, pulling Norah half an inch closer so her hip pressed solidly against his thigh. "This is Ms. Hayes," Dominic said, The tone was dead calm, but it held the promise of a broken jaw. "And if you look at her like that again, Arthur, we won't be negotiating the dock fees next month. I'll just buy the docks." Arthur's face drained of color. He swallowed hard, his eyes darting away from Norah instantly. "My apologies, Dominic. No disrespect intended to the lady. See that it stays that way." Dominic steered her away before Arthur could offer another pathetic excuse. For the next 3 hours, it was a masterclass in psychological warfare. Dominic dismantled veiled threats, secured 2 shipping contracts, and subtly terrified 3 rivals into submission. And through it all, his hand never left her. He didn't treat her like an employee playing a role. When a waiter offered champagne, Dominic took 2 glasses and handed her 1. A quiet intimacy that made the breath catch in her throat. When she shivered near the air conditioning vent, he smoothly repositioned them so his broad shoulder blocked the draft. By the time they escaped to the valet line, Norah's nerves were frayed entirely raw. The black-armored SUV pulled up to the curb. Leo stepped out, opening the rear door. Norah slid into the back seat. Dominic climbed in beside her. The door slammed shut, cutting off the noise of the city, plunging them into the quiet, leather-scented cocoon of the vehicle. The partition between them and Leo was rolled up. It was the first time they were truly alone since he had touched her in the ballroom. Norah stared straight ahead, her hands clutching her small clutch purse in her lap. The phantom heat of his hand still burned on her spine. "You played your part perfectly," Dominic said, into the quiet dark. "Was it a part?" Norah asked. The question slipped out before her brain could stop it. The champagne had stripped away the last layer of her professional caution. Dominic slowly turned his head. The streetlights sliding past the tinted windows painted shadows across his sharp features. "What did I tell you in the boardroom, Norah?" "You said you don't lie," she whispered, her knuckles turning white on her purse. "I don't." He shifted on the leather seat. He reached across the space separating them. He didn't grab her wrist or her waist. He gently pried her white-knuckled fingers off the purse. He laced his fingers through hers, palm to palm. "3 years ago, you were a broken girl who needed a wall," Dominic said, his thumb slowly stroking the back of her hand. "I gave you one. I let you hide behind the spreadsheets and the cold coffee. I let you pretend this was just a job." He leaned closer. The scent of sandalwood and danger wrapped around her. "But you didn't run when the blood hit the floor," he murmured, his face inches from hers. "You patched me up. You put on the dress. You stood beside me tonight, and you didn't flinch. The wall is gone, Norah." Norah's breathing turned shallow. She looked at his mouth. She looked at the faint, healing red line on his lower lip where she had pressed the alcohol pad. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice trembling. Dominic raised her hand, pressing his lips to her knuckles. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was a claim. "Now," Dominic said, his dark eyes locking onto hers in the shadows. "I stop pretending I just want you to take my notes." Monday morning did not begin with the grinding of the espresso machine. Norah stepped off the elevator onto the 64th floor at 7:30. The executive suite was dead quiet. She walked to her desk, set her purse in the bottom drawer, and reached for the power button on her computer monitor. Her computer was gone. The dual screens, the keyboard, the heavy ergonomic chair, the meticulously organized trays of pens entirely vanished. The polished mahogany desk sat bare, stripped of her existence. Panic spiked, cold and sharp in her chest. Had she misunderstood Saturday night? Had the kiss in the dark SUV been a test she somehow failed, resulting in a quiet, ruthless termination before she even clocked in? The heavy oak door to the inner office clicked open. Dominic stood in the doorway. He wore a charcoal suit, the jacket unbuttoned, his tie absent. He looked at her empty desk, then at her. "You're late," he said. His voice was a low, gravelly rasp. "My equipment," Norah started, trying to keep her voice steady. "My files." Dominic stepped back, pushing the oak door wider. Inside, Norah walked forward. She crossed the threshold into his cavernous office. The morning sun was fighting through the gray Chicago clouds, casting pale light across the Persian rug. There, positioned exactly 10 feet to the right of Dominic's massive executive desk, was her setup. Her monitors, her chair, her files neatly stacked. The physical wall between the boss and the secretary had been entirely demolished over the weekend. Norah stopped. She stared at the new arrangement. "You moved my desk," she said softly. "Leo moved it yesterday," Dominic corrected. He walked behind his own desk and sat down. He didn't look at his paperwork. He watched her. "I told you, the wall is gone. I don't want you sitting out there playing a receptionist when you are running half the logistics for this firm." "People will talk, Dominic. The board answers to me, and they know exactly what happens to people who talk out of turn." He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the leather blotter. "Sit down, Norah." She walked over to her new desk. The proximity was startling. She could hear the faint scratch of his pen on paper. She could smell his cologne without leaning in. She booted up her computer. The soft hum of the hard drive filled the quiet room. She opened the first email. It was a route confirmation from the New York port. "The eastern routes are clear," Norah said, her fingers finding their familiar rhythm on the keys. "Good." Silence settled over the room. It wasn't the tense, suffocating silence of the past 3 years. It was heavy, but it was warm. It was the silence of a shared space. "Dominic?" "Yes." "Do you want your coffee?" He finally stopped writing. He looked across the 10 feet of space separating them. The dark, possessive heat that had ignited in the SUV was still there, burning quietly just beneath the surface. "Only if you're making one for yourself," he replied. They didn't speak of Saturday night. They didn't need to. The shift had happened. She was no longer just the woman who guarded his door. She was the woman who sat inside the room when the doors were locked. The illusion of safety shattered on a Thursday night. It was past 9. The rain had returned, slicking the Chicago streets with a greasy, neon-lit sheen. Dominic was caught on a conference call with the Sicilians, a call that required 0 paper trails and absolutely no witnesses. He had ordered Norah to go home. She took the private elevator down to the executive parking garage. P3. The concrete cavern was entirely empty, bathed in the sickly yellow glow of sodium vapor lights. Her heels clicked loudly against the pavement. The sound echoed, bouncing off the concrete pillars. She pressed the button on her key fob. Her black sedan chirped twice in the distance. She was 20 feet away from the driver's side door when the shadows detached from the wall. 2 men. They didn't wear suits. They wore heavy canvas jackets and work boots, the attire of the docks. They moved with a slow, deliberate confidence, blocking her path to the car. Norah stopped. Her heart slammed against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in her chest. "Ms. Hayes," the taller one said. He had a thick, broken nose and a scar cutting through his left eyebrow. Late night, Norah's grip tightened on her leather purse. She didn't take a step back. 3 years ago, she would have frozen. She would have pleaded. But she had spent the last 3 years watching Dominic Russo dismantle men far more terrifying than these two. "The garage is for executive personnel only," Norah said. Her voice was shockingly calm. It sounded like Dominic. The shorter man chuckled, a wet, ugly sound. "We ain't looking for a parking spot. Gregory sent us. He runs the longshoremen. Said you and the boss insulted him at the gala. Said the boss is getting a little too possessive of the hired help." They were leverage. Gregory was too much of a coward to strike at Dominic directly, so he was trying to take a hostage. He wanted to squeeze the logistics network by taking the woman who managed it. "Gregory is making a severe miscalculation," Norah stated flatly. "If you step aside right now, I will pretend this didn't happen. If you take one more step toward me, you won't live to see the sunrise." The men stopped. They looked at each other, genuinely surprised by the ice in her voice. Then the taller one sneered. He reached into his jacket. "Tough talk for a secretary." He pulled out a heavy steel wrench. Norah calculated the distance. 10 feet. She couldn't outrun them to the elevator. She couldn't fight them. But she refused to scream. A heavy, unnatural click echoed through the empty garage. It was the sound of a hammer being cocked back on a high-caliber handgun. "Drop it." The voice didn't echo. It was a dead, flat frequency that seemed to suck the oxygen out of the air. Norah didn't turn around. She knew the voice. The two men froze. The blood drained from the taller man's face. He looked past Norah into the shadows near the elevator bank. Dominic walked into the yellow light. He hadn't stayed upstairs. He had followed her down. He held a matte black pistol in his right hand, the barrel leveled squarely at the center of the taller man's chest. His face was a mask of absolute, terrifying murder. "Dominic, we was just—" the shorter man stammered, raising his hands. "I said drop it," Dominic repeated softly. The steel wrench clattered onto the concrete. Dominic didn't walk fast. He stalked forward, his eyes locked entirely on the men who had threatened what was his. He bypassed Norah without a glance, keeping his body positioned between her and them. When he reached the taller man, Dominic didn't yell. He didn't ask questions. He drove the heavy steel barrel of the pistol directly into the man's face. Bone crunched. The man collapsed instantly, screaming, clutching a shattered nose. The shorter man lunged, panicking. Dominic pivoted on his heel, catching the man by the throat with his left hand. He slammed the dock worker backward against a concrete pillar with enough force to knock the air from his lungs. Dominic pressed the barrel of the gun hard under the man's chin, forcing his head back. "Listen to me very carefully," Dominic whispered. The silence in the garage amplified the lethal promise in his tone. "You go back to Gregory. You tell him I am keeping the docks. I am keeping the transit routes. And if he ever looks in the direction of this woman again, I will burn his Union Hall to the ground with him inside it. Do you understand?" The man choked, nodding frantically, his eyes rolling back in terror. Dominic let him go. The man dropped to the pavement, gasping for air. He scrambled to his feet, grabbed his groaning partner by the jacket collar, and dragged him toward the exit stairwell. The heavy metal door slammed shut behind them. The garage was silent again. Dominic stood breathing heavily in the yellow light. He slowly lowered the gun, engaging the safety with a sharp click, and slid it back into his shoulder holster. He turned around. He looked at Norah. She was standing exactly where he left her. She wasn't crying. She wasn't shaking. He closed the distance between them in 3 long strides. He didn't ask if she was okay. He grabbed her. His large hands framed her face, his thumbs pressing hard into her cheekbones. He looked into her eyes, searching for the trauma, searching for the fear. "Did they touch you?" he demanded, his voice thick with a dark, violent edge. "No," Norah breathed. "Did they touch you?" he repeated louder, the control finally slipping. "No, Dominic, I'm fine." She reached up, wrapping her hands around his thick wrists. "I handled it. I told them what you would do." Dominic let out a harsh, shuddering breath. The violence bled out of him, replaced instantly by a crushing, desperate need. He dropped his hands from her face, wrapping his arms around her waist, pulling her hard against his chest. "You shouldn't have to handle it," he growled into her hair. "You shouldn't be down here alone." "I am not afraid of them," Norah said, resting her cheek against the solid, warm wall of his chest. She could hear his heart hammering, as frantic as her own. "I am not Caleb, Dominic. I don't break when it gets ugly." Dominic pulled back slightly. He looked down at her, his dark eyes burning. The last remnants of the boss and the secretary burned to ash right there on the concrete. He kissed her. It wasn't a gentle press of knuckles in the back of an SUV. It was a collision. It was bruised, desperate, and entirely consuming. He backed her against the side of her car, his hands gripping her hips, devouring the space between them. Norah didn't pull away. She leaned into it, her fingers tangling in the collar of his expensive shirt, pulling him closer. She tasted the adrenaline, the danger, and the absolute certainty that this man would burn down the city before he let anyone harm her. They bypassed her apartment entirely. The private elevator shot straight to the 65th floor, opening into a sprawling expanse of glass and shadowed steel. The Chicago skyline bled through the floor-to-ceiling windows, a chaotic grid of sodium lights and storm clouds. Dominic didn't hit the light switch. He moved through the dark with the heavy, exhausted grace of a man who had just finished a war. He shrugged off his ruined suit jacket, letting it drop over the back of a leather sofa. The shoulder holster came next. He unbuckled the straps and laid the rig heavily onto the granite kitchen island. The metallic clack of the steel barrel hitting the stone echoed in the quiet room. It was the sound of a period at the end of a very violent sentence. He poured 2 fingers of scotch into a pair of crystal glasses. He crossed the room, stopping beside Norah, where she stood watching the rain streak the glass. He handed her a drink. "To the docks," he murmured. Norah took it. The liquor burned a clean, hot path down her throat, stripping away the lingering chill of the concrete garage. "Gregory will retaliate," she stated, her mind automatically locking back onto the chessboard. "He lost face. The union will strike." Dominic reached out, taking the glass from her hand. He set it on the window ledge beside his own. "Let him," Dominic said. He stepped into her space. His hands found her waist, heavy and warm, tracing the line of her ribs. I have the best tactician in the city sitting 10 feet from my desk. Let him try. He reached up, his fingers sliding into her meticulously pinned hair. One by one, he pulled the pins loose. They hit the hardwood floor with faint, sharp clicks. Her hair tumbled down, heavy and dark against her shoulders. The severe, untouchable secretary vanished. I told Caleb I was taken in that boardroom, Norah whispered, resting her hands flat against the solid expanse of his chest. I didn't